Harlem, New York, February 21st, 1965, 9:17 a.m. Bumpy Johnson's phone rang with the kind of urgency that made him answer before the second ring, the kind of call that meant something was wrong and time was running out and decisions needed to be made immediately. The voice on the other end was Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's wife. She was trying to sound calm, but Bumpy could hear the fear underneath. The kind of fear that came from knowing your family was in danger and not knowing what to do about it. Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry to call so early. I know Malcolm asked you not to get involved anymore, but something's wrong. I can feel it. The house was firebombed last week. We've been getting threats. Malcolm's speaking at the Audubon today at 1 o'clock, and I have this feeling that something terrible is going to happen. If you're watching this story about Bumpy Johnson saving Malcolm X's children 3 hours before the assassination, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the stories about the moments that changed history, but that history books left out. Your engagement helps this story reach people who need to hear it. Bumpy had known Malcolm X for over a decade, had watched him rise from street hustler to Nation of Islam minister, to national spokesman, to independent leader who'd broken with the nation and who was now being hunted by the organization he'd once served. They'd had their last real conversation 3 weeks earlier. Malcolm had been exhausted, paranoid, knowing that people wanted him dead but not knowing exactly who or when or how the end would come. Bumpy had offered protection, had offered to station his men around Malcolm's family, had offered everything that 40 years of being Harlem's most powerful criminal had taught him about staying alive when people wanted you dead, but Malcolm had refused, had said he didn't want to owe favors to organized crime, had said he needed to handle his own security, had said that if they were going to kill him, at least his death wouldn't be complicated by connections to people like Bumpy. It had been the last time they'd spoken directly. But Bumpy had been watching anyway, had been hearing things through his network, had been learning that the threats against Malcolm were getting more specific, more credible, that something was being planned. And now Betty was calling, 3 hours before Malcolm was scheduled to speak at the Audubon ballroom, calling because a wife's instinct told her that today was the day, that whatever was coming now. Mrs. Shabazz, Bumpy said carefully, where are Malcolm's children right now? They're here, at home, all 4 of them. I was going to bring them to the Audubon for Malcolm's speech. He likes having them there. Says it reminds him why he's fighting. Don't bring them, Bumpy said immediately, his voice hard, final. Whatever you do, don't bring those children to the Audubon today. Something's wrong. I can feel it too. Betty had been silent for several seconds. Then, what should I do? If I don't come, Malcolm will worry. If I tell him why, he'll tell me I'm being paranoid. But I can't shake this feeling that if I bring my children to that ballroom today, something terrible will happen to them. Bumpy had made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Pack a bag for you and the children. Enough for a few days. I'm sending someone to get you in 20 minutes. You're going to leave the city. Go somewhere safe. Somewhere nobody knows about. Stay there until this is over. What about Malcolm? Betty had asked. Tell him you're sick. Tell him the children are sick. Tell him whatever keeps him from worrying but gets you and those girls away from New York today. I'll handle the rest. At 9:35 a.m., William Hewlett, Bumpy's most trusted bodyguard, had arrived at the Shabazz family home in East Elmhurst, Queens, a modest house that had been firebombed 1 week earlier on February 14th, destroying much of the interior and forcing the family to live with the constant smell of smoke and the constant reminder that someone wanted them dead. Betty had been waiting with 4 small girls. Atala, 6 years old, Kubala, 4, Ilyasa, 3, and Gamila, not yet 2, 4 children who didn't understand why their mother was crying while packing their clothes, why this large man was hurrying them into a car, why they were leaving in such a rush. Hewlett had driven them to a safe house in Newark that Bumpy maintained for emergencies. A small apartment in a building owned by someone who owed Bumpy enough favors that questions wouldn't be asked and locations wouldn't be revealed. He'd stationed 2 of Bumpy's men outside, had made sure Betty and the children had food, had blankets, had everything they'd need to stay hidden for however long this took. And at 10:23 a.m., Hewlett had called Bumpy to confirm. The family's safe. They're in Newark. No one followed us. No one knows where they are. Bumpy had felt relief, temporary relief, because Betty and the children were safe. But Malcolm was still in danger. Malcolm was still going to that ballroom, and Bumpy knew, with the certainty that came from 40 years of surviving in a world where people killed each other over territory and money and ideology, that something was going to happen today. This is where Bumpy Johnson does everything he can to save Malcolm X. But sometimes fate is stronger than protection. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe, because what happens next is one of history's great tragedies. Every comment and subscription helps more people discover these untold stories. Bumpy had tried to reach Malcolm directly, had called the hotel where Malcolm was staying, had left messages, had sent people to find him. But Malcolm was moving, was preparing for his speech, was surrounded by his own security who didn't trust Bumpy's people and who wouldn't let them close enough to deliver warnings. At 11:30 a.m., Bumpy had sent 3 of his most reliable men to the Audubon ballroom, not to protect Malcolm directly, that would have been refused, but to watch, to position themselves in the audience, to be ready to intervene if the attack came. But Bumpy's men had been stopped at the door. Malcolm's security team had recognized them as Bumpy's people, had refused them entry, had said that Malcolm had specifically requested that organized crime figures stay away from his events, that their presence would be used against him, that he needed to keep his movement separate from Harlem's criminal element. Bumpy's men had argued, had tried to explain that they were there to help. But Malcolm's security had been firm, and Bumpy's men had been forced to leave. At 12:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Malcolm X was scheduled to begin speaking, Bumpy had made one final attempt, had driven to the Audubon himself, had tried to enter through a side door, had been stopped by security who knew exactly who he was. Bumpy had looked at these young men, Malcolm's followers, people who believed they were protecting their leader, and had tried one last time. There's going to be an attack today. I don't know exactly when or exactly how, but something's coming. You need to search everyone who enters. You need to check for weapons. You need to be ready. The security team had looked at each other, had clearly wanted to take Bumpy seriously because everyone in Harlem knew that when Bumpy Johnson said something was going to happen, it usually did. But they also had their orders. Malcolm didn't want Bumpy's help, didn't want his protection, didn't want the complication of owing favors to criminals. Mr. Johnson, one of them had said respectfully, we appreciate the warning, but Brother Malcolm has asked that you not be involved. We have our own security. We'll handle it. Bumpy had stood there for 10 seconds, had looked at these young men who were about to fail at the one job that mattered, had wanted to push past them, had wanted to force his way in, had wanted to do whatever it took to save Malcolm X's life. But he couldn't. Because Malcolm had made his choice, had chosen independence over protection, had chosen to face whatever was coming without the help of people like Bumpy Johnson. So Bumpy had done the only thing left. He'd made sure Malcolm's family was safe. He'd gotten Betty and those 4 little girls away from New York. He'd ensured that whatever happened at the Audubon ballroom today, Malcolm's children would survive. And then Bumpy had walked away, had gotten back in his car, had returned to his office on 125th Street, and had waited for the news he knew was coming. At 3010 p, the phone had rung. The voice on the other end was shaking. Mr. Turr, Johnson Malcolm's been shot. At the Audubon. Multiple shooters. They're saying he's dead. Bumpy had closed his eyes. Had felt something that he hadn't felt in decades. Complete helplessness. Because he'd known this was coming. had tried to stop it, had done everything except force his way past Malcolm's security and stand between Malcolm and the bullets. And it hadn't been enough. Malcolm X was dead, shot 21 times, killed in front of an audience of 400 people, assassinated by men who'd walked into the Audubon ballroom carrying weapons that should have been found if anyone had been properly searching. The security that had turned Bumpy away had failed. The protection that Malcolm had chosen instead of Bumpy's help had been inadequate. And now Malcolm was gone. But his children were alive. His wife was safe. 4 little girls who would grow up without their father. But who would grow up, would live, would carry Malcolm's legacy forward. Because 3 hours before the assassination, Bumpy Johnson had gotten a phone call from a terrified wife, and he'd done the one thing Malcolm would have allowed. He protected the family. He'd saved the children. Betty Shabazz and her 4 daughters had stayed in Newark for 3 days, had listened to the news about Malcolm's death, had cried in a small apartment surrounded by Bumpy's men who stood guard outside and who made sure that whatever had killed Malcolm didn't reach his family. When Betty finally returned to New York, when she finally faced the reality of raising 4 children alone, she'd called Bumpy Johnson, had thanked him for saving their lives, had told him that Malcolm would have been grateful even though he couldn't admit it while he was alive. And Bumpy had said something that Betty would remember for the rest of her life. Malcolm was the bravest man I ever knew. He chose principle over protection. He chose independence over safety. I didn't agree with that choice, but I respected it. The least I could do was make sure his children survived the consequences. Before we finish the story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from, and subscribe because sometimes saving who you can is all anyone can do. Your support helps us keep bringing these hidden histories to light. Betty Shabazz lived until 1997, raised her daughters, became an educator and civil rights advocate, carried Malcolm's message forward for 32 years after his death, and every year on February 21st, the anniversary of Malcolm's assassination, Betty would receive flowers, no card, no signature, just flowers delivered to her door. She never confirmed publicly who sent them, but everyone close to the family knew. Bumpy Johnson until his death in 1968, and after Bumpy died, his family continued the tradition. For 29 years, every February 21st, flowers for the widow of the man Bumpy couldn't save, honoring the children whose lives he protected 3 hours before everything changed. Malcolm X's 4 daughters all survived to adulthood. All carried their father's legacy in different ways. Atala became an actress and author. Kubala became an activist. Eliza became a professor and writer. Gamila chose a private life. And when they told their father's story, when they spoke about February 21st, 1965, some of them would mention that they weren't at the Audubon ballroom that day, that their mother had taken them to Newark, that someone had warned them to leave. They never said who, never mentioned Bumpy Johnson's name publicly, but privately the family knew. Malcolm's children lived because a gangster had answered a desperate phone call at 9:17 a.m. and had made sure they were nowhere near the Audubon ballroom when the bullets started flying 3 hours later. That's the story of February 21st, 1965. The morning Bumpy Johnson saved Malcolm X's children while being unable to save Malcolm himself. 3 hours between a phone call and an assassination. 3 hours to get a family to safety while watching a friend walk toward his death and being powerless to stop it. Bumpy Johnson lived with that for the rest of his life. Lived with knowing he'd saved 4 children, but lost Malcolm. Lived with the question of whether he could have done more. Whether he should have forced his way past security. Whether saving the man mattered more than respecting his wishes. But Betty Shabazz never doubted, never questioned, never wondered if Bumpy had done enough. Because her children lived, because 4 little girls who would have been at the Audubon ballroom that day, who would have watched their father die, who might have been caught in the crossfire themselves, were safe in Newark when the bullets started flying. And sometimes, When you can't save everyone, saving who you can is the only victory possible. Malcolm X died on February 21st, 1965, shot 21 times in front of 400 witnesses, but his children lived, and Bumpy Johnson, the gangster Malcolm had kept at arm's length, had made sure of that. 3 hours. 1 phone call. 4 little girls saved. 1 tragedy prevented in the midst of a tragedy that couldn't be stopped. That was Bumpy Johnson's last gift to Malcolm X, and Malcolm's daughters carried it forward for the rest of their lives.